Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. There was an interesting article, an op-ed by the developer of a game called Airscape: The Fall of Gravity, which you can actually see in the background right there as I attempt to play it absolutely terribly. And the name of the op-ed was Good Isn't Good Enough, releasing an indie game in 2015, which, for the long or the short of it, concludes that you can make a good game and you can attempt to market it correctly, and it can still be an absolute sales disaster. Indeed, the game had only sold 150 copies by the time that he'd written this, and the game had been out for a couple of weeks. That's an extremely low number. Bear in mind, this game is also on Steam, so it's not like it was restricted by its sales platform or anything like that. And the article goes on to try and analyze exactly why. And I think that most of the conclusions that this developer has come to are pretty accurate, actually. He claims that, making a good game is not a surefire way to gain success, and having played a bit of the game, I'd say, yeah, it's a reasonably good game. It's not my sort of thing, it's definitely not my sort of genre, and it's certainly got its flaws, but it's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. And yet that's not enough in 2015. You can still have it bomb in terms of sales. I suppose the weird irony is that the only reason this game is getting attention is because it didn't get attention. This article came out and it ended up being upvoted fairly highly on Reddit, and no doubt will be referred to in numerous pieces of media, myself included. I find it an interesting topic, which is why I'm looking at it. But the weird thing is, if the developer hadn't complained about the sales, then I would never have noticed the game. Did I receive a copy of the game? Yeah, I did. I absolutely did. It is there amongst currently 311 review copies on the list of stuff that I have not done yet, and most of those games will not be covered. I just won't get to them. They pass the point of the relevance window, and then they just don't get covered. It is truly impossible in this day and age to cover everything that comes out on Steam. And the interesting thing about this situation is that somehow this situation is different to indies past. And I don't think that's really the case. Back when Steam was being very restrictive as to the games that could get onto its platform, there were certainly a few games which deserved to do better that were not getting access to a huge consumer base, and they were suffering as a direct result. But I think the reality is that there were still huge numbers of games coming out a few years ago. It's not like there's been a sudden surge in the number of games that are being developed, at least I haven't seen any evidence of that. It's just those games weren't on Steam, they were on smaller platforms like Desura that weren't getting that kind of attention, or they were attempting to sell themselves through places like Gamersgate and smaller websites that just didn't have that customer base. And they were failing, in the same way that games are now failing. I agree with his statement that Steam is no longer the magic bullet, but I have to wonder if it was in the first place, if it wasn't just all a facade. Games that got on Steam when Steam was restrictive probably did better as a result of them getting more attention. They were less lost in the crowd as games currently are now on Steam, as a result of the huge number of releases on a daily basis. However, that doesn't mean that crowd suddenly appeared over the last couple of years. No, they've been around for a long time, they've just been on different platforms, and those games were still suffering. As a result, they were suffering from lack of attention and market saturation and all sorts of things like that. In the case of Airscape, what it is essentially a pretty difficult platformer with some gravity mechanics. The problem is there are a lot of pretty difficult platformers, and I have to wonder just how large the market for these games really is. For every Meat Boy, you have so many more games in the genre that are simply not getting a lot of attention, and one has to wonder if Meat Boy is a sign of the revival of enthusiasm for that genre, or merely an outlier. Was it merely the exception that proved the rule? Was it a game that so far transcended the restrictions of that particular genre that it appealed to the mass market? You have to be very careful when you make claims like certain genre is back, and use the success of one particular game as evidence of that. I don't think Meat Boy is an indication that platformers are back and are super popular, because there really hasn't been a great deal of follow-up from that. If a genre is truly alive again in a big way, then games in that genre will continue to sell well. The weird thing is that what can then happen is developers look towards that genre, think that there's something going on there, and decide to develop a game in it. And what ends up happening is a huge amount of oversaturation, which can cause disinterest in the genre in general. When too many games are made in a genre, and there's not enough to differentiate them, then yes, people can lose interest in it. They can feel that there's just too much, that it's completely oversaturated, and that it has nothing new to offer. And I certainly wouldn't blame them when it comes to platformers on Steam. There are so many of them. And for every Braid, for every Meat Boy, for every Limbo, there are hundreds of other games that simply do not catch people's imagination. You need only look for platformer on Steam and find there are 51 pages, at least with about 25 plus games on each, all classified as platformers, and the majority of them did not sell that well. That's the sad reality of it. And what can be done about that? Was it all about press coverage? You know, he claims that the game got a number of positive reviews on Metacritic. The problem with that is that I'm looking at the list of sites that reviewed it, a total of 6, and none of those are major sites in any way. So they don't really have much of an audience to expose the game to, and Metacritic aggregation is no substitute for a real audience that actually relies on the opinions and recommendations of such a site. What about new media? Was it covered well on YouTube or anywhere else? Well, there's a giant bomb quick look of the game, and indeed the article points out a Let's Play by Jacksepticeye, who is a very popular Let's Player with over 6 million subscribers, and the video has over 500,000 views. Now, the shocking thing, I think, for many people is that the developer claims that this video generated about 20 sales. That's going to be shocking to a lot of people. Think, well, it went out to 500,000 people, how could it only generate 20 sales? It's not that surprising to somebody that is into YouTube, though, that actually does YouTube for a living, because they are probably aware of the sort of demographics that Let's Play channels generally get, and they're usually pretty young kids that are watching for entertainment. They're not watching for recommendations of games to buy. As a result, these Let's Plays may get a huge amount of views and yet translate to almost no sales. There are, however, exceptions to that rule, absolutely. There are games that I view as so-called beauty baits, that there's actually an aspect of design which is specifically oriented to deliberately appeal to certain kinds of Let's Players, and to generate those Let's Play moments, those funny moments, those screamy moments. And sometimes those games do very, very well as a result of Let's Play coverage and things like that. You know, if you look at something like Goat Simulator, obviously designed in a way that would create wacky YouTube moments, covered by a huge amount of people, very, very successful. There's a great example, actually, the developers of Surgeon Simulator. That was a game that did very, very well, and in large part due to its exposure on YouTube. They made another game that didn't do very well at all, which is I Am Bread. And it seemed like what that was trying to do was emulate the success of Surgeon Simulator, and as a result, a bunch of YouTubers jumped on it, because it was clearly marketed towards them. It was kind of baiting them. And yet, if we go by Steam Spy sales figures, I Am Bread didn't do very well at all. Certainly not compared to Surgeon Simulator. According to Steam Spy, over 1.4 million people own Surgeon Simulator, whereas I Am Bread has not even reached 250,000 yet. And I say not even reached, but we're talking about a game that got huge YouTube exposure, which didn't necessarily translate into a massive amount of sales, although certainly far, far more than something like Airscape would. But one has to wonder if Airscape would ever translate to a lot of sales because of the kind of game that it is, versus the sort of thing that I Am Bread is. Yeah, if someone big like Jacksepticeye plays this, it's going to give it exposure, but does that game then resonate with the audience? And whose fault is that, really? You know, you can sometimes blame the person playing it, that they just didn't present it in the right way, but is that really their job? No, it's not their job to sell games for you. Absolutely not. And really, does that younger audience have any real interest in a hardcore platformer like that? I have to wonder. I really do. There are certainly some instances where that sort of level of promotion has really helped the success of a game that has been in that particular genre, but there are plenty of instances where that is not the case. For every success, there are so many failures. I don't even know if a critically orientated channel like this would actually help the sales of a game like this all that much, because it's known that this is not a genre that I'm particularly interested in, and I'm not great at presenting it. I don't have the skill level, and I don't have the interest, and I'm not going to convey enthusiasm over a genre that I really don't enjoy. It is one of those cases where, yes, you made a decent game, and it didn't matter that your game was decent, because nobody really paid attention regardless. Is that something you can necessarily fix? I don't really think so. I don't think the failure of a game like this is necessarily anybody's fault. The reality is, of course, that even sites that are just writing quick articles still don't have the time or space to adequately communicate every single game release that's coming their way. And when it comes to YouTubers, they're even more restricted because we can't release 20 articles in a day. We certainly can't release 20 videos in a day. Not only is there a time constraint, but there's a business reason not to. It results in severe diminishing returns and even driving people away from the channel. That's just how YouTube works. And it's not the developer's fault. They did market it. You know, I have a key for this. But more often than not, when it comes to this genre, I'm probably not going to cover it. It's not a genre that I'm all that interested in. And I think that when you communicate your particular likes and dislikes to your audience, you sort of attract like-minded people. So less people are going to be interested in my audience in something like this, a platformer, than they would be in maybe an RTS or a CCG or something along those lines. I mean, really, if I had any suggestion, it would be don't release your game at $10. I know there's a risk of this race to the bottom that has happened a great deal on the App Store, where games are frankly underpriced for what they really should be worth. But we're not the guys that get to decide what they should be worth. That's up to the consumer. And yet another $9.99 platformer on Steam is probably going to be overlooked by a lot of people, especially when during Steam sales they can pick things up incredibly cheaply. I mean, you can get Grim Fandango remastered right now for $5. That's half the price of Airscape, and Grim Fandango is a masterpiece. You can pick up Killer is Dead for $4, as opposed to $9.99 for this. You can grab Chivalry for $5, Hammerwatch for $2.50. These are all games that have a lot to offer and yet are priced very, very low. And sometimes you can price your game very low and get attention that way. You know, I think Shower with Your Dad Simulator is one of those games that's going to do pretty well as a result of a very low price and a very weird theme. You know, it's marketed in a very strange way, and that's got people's curiosity. I don't think a game like this is really ever going to generate huge amounts of curiosity from anybody, because it really does just blend in with a huge number of games in the exact same genre. And the thing is that making your game stand out from that often involves compromising whatever your vision for it will be. They made some interesting comments in the article that perhaps the aesthetic didn't fit the difficulty level all that much. You know, it's a cutesy-looking game with a nice sweeping orchestral soundtrack, and yet it's balls hard. You know, it's very frustratingly difficult. Is there a mismatch there in terms of aesthetic versus mechanics? Should you present a very difficult game in a way that looks more difficult? It's such a strange idea, isn't it? I think Dark Souls is a great example of a game that is difficult and presents that difficulty through its grim and very hopeless kind of world. Whereas if Dark Souls was actually based in a world of puppies and giant teddy bears, it might not be a lesser game mechanically, but there would be a great deal of dissonance between its presentation and its mechanics and the overall theme. And games are absolutely more than the sum of their parts. You can make a great game and you could still present it in a really poor way, and as a result it just doesn't resonate with people. I definitely think there's an element of that, no doubt. Some people claim there's an indie extinction event on the horizon, that the oversaturation of the market is making it increasingly unsustainable to create games simply because there isn't enough money to go around to make sure that each of these games can be successful. The thing is, I really believe that it's always been this way. We perhaps got this idea in our heads that there was a golden age of indie gaming thanks to a few very successful titles. We perhaps got the idea in our head that because of YouTube, the traditional media barricade, I suppose, in the way of success had evaporated, that it was possible for any game to become successful and go viral. And the thing is, it was always possible. I don't think it's any more or less possible now than it was previously. There have always been too many video games, no doubt. There have always been more failures than successes. Perhaps I think it was our perception that was incorrect after so many articles claiming that indie was in a wonderful renaissance and that things were doing incredibly well, and of course celebrating the successes of those few that really went above and beyond that were huge mega hits. And yet they never really mentioned all the other guys, because of course the media never noticed them, and therein lies the catch-22, isn't it? The media didn't notice them, so they didn't do very well, but if they don't do very well, the media is not likely to notice them. Indeed, the article addresses this as the death spiral. The press make no content, people aren't interested, and the press do not notice. Or indeed they do, because in this case, we noticed that the press weren't interested, or more accurately, that people weren't interested. It's not worth blaming the press or blaming media or even blaming the developer for this. It's not their fault that they made a game that didn't do very well, and it's not the press's fault, because it's not their job to make sure that a game does well in the first place. And even when they do try to do that, even when there is advocacy for a particular title, that doesn't necessarily work, as we saw with the commercial failure of Sunset, for instance, which was pushed heavily by certain popular media outlets and yet fell flat on its face and was a commercial failure. Indeed, there was more coverage of the game's failure than there was of the game's release, perhaps, and even that didn't necessarily help it. Some games are simply not going to resonate, and perhaps the market for games is maybe a little bit smaller than we think. Steam has a great user base, but how many of those people are regularly buying games? There's a good read on this over on Medium, which is supported, of course, by data from Steam Spy, claiming that your target audience does not exist, and that audiences are vastly different. They made some interesting little points. The TLDR at the bottom is great. I would recommend reading the whole article because I think it's very fascinating, but the TLDR is this: gamers are different, don't overgeneralize, and just because a gamer plays one game doesn't mean he'll try other games in the genre or on that platform, and the core audience of the PC games market that supports developers with smaller titles is actually rather tiny. I think while it certainly would be a shame if less indie games were made in the future, and if this indie-ocalypse or whatever they want to call it actually does happen, this extinction event or market crash, one has to wonder if that's just the natural way of things. We can't artificially support such a huge number of games. There's no real way to do that. We can't force people to buy things. And if we start to chastise gamers for that, then we're just going to build resentment within the audience, which is, frankly, a terrible idea. It's utterly self-destructive. This is why I really admire the approach of Daniel West. This op-ed is extremely thoughtful. It's not placing the blame. It's simply trying to analyze the situation. I love that. That's amazing. And that to me is so much better than the mewling and the hand-wringing and the navel-gazing and trying to tell gamers what they should be buying and even trying to guilt-trip them as they don't do that. We must buy this game because it's innovative. We must buy this game because it's progressive. We must buy this game to support this particular cause. That simply is not going to work. If gamers are buying games for any other reason than they like the game and think they'll actually get some enjoyment and fulfillment out of it, then they're doing it wrong, and that is never sustainable. You can't build an industry on the back of something so unreliable. I'm not going to go and tell you that you should buy this game because I'm sad for the developers. I am a bit sad for them, but you should only buy this game if you're interested in the genre and you think that you'd actually enjoy it. Don't buy games out of pity. Don't buy games for any other reason than it's a game you might enjoy playing. Now, the question is, as a media outlet, I suppose you'd call a YouTube channel that, is there anything that I can do? Is there anything that I even should do? You know, what is the level of my responsibility here? I have to wonder. As I've already stated, it's impossible to cover everything, but in a previous audio blog, I talked a little bit about Running with Rifles, a game that was in early access for a very long time, and the Desura Alpha program before that, and a thread where players of the game were complaining that there simply weren't enough players for the game anymore, and saying, hey, you should market it better, and the developer of the game replied as like, look, we tried, we really did. And they did. They absolutely did. These are not companies that are just being lazy when it comes to their marketing. That's not the reason why their games are necessarily not selling. Sometimes it just doesn't matter how much you market something, it can still fall flat on its face, and that's true perhaps even of some of the biggest titles, whether it be in games or in other forms of media. People often ask me, what should you do to become successful on YouTube? And my answer these days is that there is no answer to that. A lot of us became popular through a series of seemingly random events, a confluence of things which perhaps can't be replicated. Going viral, the concept of going viral, is really little more than a chaotic series of events and causation eventually leading to success. It's often not something you did. It's nothing that you had control over. You can make quality content and get ignored. So many people are. You can make terrible content and do really well. Again, some people do. This is only magnified when you ask people to pay you money for your title. That's going to limit your audience even further, as sad as it sounds. There is no right answer. Even if a game gets tons of coverage, that doesn't necessarily translate to sales. Even if a game does well in reviews, that doesn't necessarily translate to sales. Even if a game is mechanically solid and reasonably creative, such as Airscape, at least in my limited exposure to it, that doesn't necessarily translate into sales. This sounds very doom and gloom, I suppose. And in a way it kind of is. But I suppose it's about tempering expectations, for the most part. It's more difficult to do when you're dedicating your life to working on something which takes a lot of time to create. My advice to people getting into YouTube is don't go in expecting to make any money. Create the content because you're passionate about it. It's more difficult to give that advice to people that are dedicating years of their life to game development. It's a much harder job than doing the YouTube. It's something that you have to commit full time to doing in the vast majority of circumstances. And ultimately, the world says, you gotta pay rent, son, you gotta pay taxes, you gotta pay for all of these things. You can't just mess around doing what you want to do. The ultimate dream is to go into business for yourself, create a passion project, and have it become super successful, and have it become your full-time job. But the unfortunate reality is that so many people are not going to be able to do that. Indie games, I think, perhaps more so than most things in this industry, are all about the passion. But it's often very difficult to communicate that passion to the audience and also get them to share at least a sliver of the passion that you have for your product. If you came here looking for a catch-all solution, a magic bullet, a way to avoid this sort of fate, then I don't have the answers for you, and I don't think anybody does. In fact, people that claim that they do are perhaps trying to mislead you and make their own buck, as opposed to anything else, so do watch out for that. There are very few people that can guarantee you success, if anybody, in this particular industry, especially when it comes to indie game development. Maybe in a few years we do get less indie games as a result of that. And maybe that's the way it has to be. Maybe that's just natural selection. Maybe claiming there's a way to avoid that is idealism at best and naive and misguided at worst. Oh well. I think the best thing that we can do on this channel is to try and give as many of these games as possible at least a little bit of a fair shake. But you can never guarantee, no matter how you try, that there's going to be an audience and that they're actually going to care. My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.